Alright, let's go. For most of the 20th century, the working assumption in anthropology was that war is a recent invention, something that arrived with cities, with grain surplus, with kings. Before that, the story went, small bands of hunter-gatherers had too little to fight over and too much to lose by trying. The bones say otherwise. If you want to uncover the darkest truths buried in human history, hit subscribe now. Because what these bones reveal about our past only gets more disturbing. Across 5 continents and 14,000 years, the skeletal record keeps turning up the same signature. Blunt force to the skull, embedded projectile points, cut marks in patterns no butchery produces, and bodies deposited in numbers that no single accident explains. Some of these events involved a few dozen people. One of them may have involved several thousand, proportionally. Several of them wiped out a larger share of their community than either world war killed of its combatant nations, and did it with stone axes, fire-hardened spears, and flint arrowheads rather than anything resembling industrial weaponry. None of the sites on this list come with a name for the war they belong to, a flag for either side, or a monument raised by the winners. What they come with is bone, fracture patterns, embedded points, cut marks logged under a microscope by researchers working in labs from Bordeaux to Aarhus to Vermilion, South Dakota. This is what that record actually contains, ranked from the most recent to the earliest confirmed instance of organized human violence yet found anywhere on Earth, number 10. Alken Enge is a lake in central Jutland, Denmark, today by farmland and a scatter of holiday cottages. In the 19th century, peat cutters working the wetland at its southern edge kept turning up human bones. Nobody thought much of it. Bones in a Danish bog were not, by 1900, a novelty. The site sat mostly unexamined until 2008, when a team from Aarhus University, led by archaeologist Mads Kaler Holst, began a systematic excavation of a 75-hectare stretch of the wetland known as Alken Enge. What they found did not resemble a burial. It resembled a battlefield that had been cleared, sorted, and thrown away. By 2014, the excavation had recovered more than 2,000 bones and bone fragments, representing a minimum of 82 individuals. Based on the density and distribution of finds across the unexcavated remainder of the wetland, Holst's team estimated the true total at more than 380 people, all of them male, most of them young adults. Radiocarbon dating placed the event in the early 1st century AD, within a few decades of the birth of Christ. The bones told a story in 2 acts. The first act was violence, unhealed fractures from blunt weapons, cut marks from blades, at least one cranium crushed by a strike from behind. The second act was worse. Isotopic and taphonomic analysis showed the bodies had lain exposed on open ground for 6 months to a year before anyone touched them, long enough for wolves, foxes, and ravens to gnaw the ends of the long bones. Only after that did someone return, gather the skeletonized and partly disarticulated remains, and carry them to the lake. What they did next is the detail that makes Alken Enge unusual. 4 pelvic bones, from 4 different men, had been threaded onto a single wooden stick. Cut and scrape marks on other bones suggest deliberate defleshing, done long after death, for no practical reason connected to disposal. This was not burial. It was display, performed by the winning side over the picked clean remains of the losing one, and then sunk in a lake that the community that did it clearly regarded as sacred ground. No body has a name for either army. There is no written source for this conflict. Rome's frontier at the time sat a few hundred kilometers to the south, and its historians never mention it. Holst has connected the date loosely to the turbulence of the early Roman contact period in Germania, when new pressures and new alliances were reshaping the tribal map of the north, but the connection is circumstantial. No inscription names the dead. No neighboring settlement claims the victory. What is left is a lake bed holding the collected, curated bones of an entire defeated force, arranged with a care that has nothing to do with grief. Subsequent test excavations across the wider 40-hectare wetland, carried out through the 2010s, have continued to return human bone wherever the team has dug, which is the reason the total estimate keeps climbing rather than settling. Most of the site remains untouched. The lake, in other words, is still holding. Number 9. Crow Creek. The Missouri River bluffs of south-central South Dakota carry the low earthworks of a large fortified village, occupied by initial coalescent farmers in the early 14th century. The village covered more than 7 hectares and was ringed by a bastion defensive ditch, the second such ditch built at the site, evidence that the people living there already understood they were in danger and were in the middle of upgrading their defenses when the danger arrived. The ditch was found eroding out of a riverbank in 1978, and a team from the University of South Dakota, led by project director Larry Zimmerman and osteologist P. Willie, excavated it that summer. What they recovered, using a count of right temporal bones to avoid double-counting fragments, was the remains of at least 486 individuals, men, women, children, and infants, deposited in a mass grave dug into the abandoned defensive ditch itself. The mutilation was extensive and consistent. More than 90% of the recovered crania showed evidence of scalping. Many bodies had been decapitated, and hands and feet were largely missing from the assemblage, likely lost to scavengers during a period of exposure that the tooth marks on the remaining long bones confirm took place before burial. Radiocarbon dating of a fire lit over the grave after interment places the burial event at around 1325 AD, give or take several decades. Willie's demographic analysis found something specific. The population profile skewed toward the very young, the old, and the vulnerable, with a conspicuous absence of women of prime childbearing age. That absence has one plausible explanation: they were taken. This was not simply a massacre. It has the shape of a raid whose purpose included the seizure of captives, layered on top of an act of near-total extermination against everyone the raiders did not want alive. Estimates for the size of the attacking force run into the hundreds, based on the scale of destruction and the speed with which a village defended by a freshly reinforced ditch was overrun. What triggered it is invisible to archaeology. Climate reconstructions for the northern plains in this period show worsening drought and shrinking bison range, a resource-based contracting at the exact moment population along the Missouri was growing, forcing farming and hunting communities into tighter and tighter competition for the same stretch of river valley. Zimmerman's later work on the collection makes one further point worth sitting with. The village's fortification ditch was in the process of being enlarged when the attack came. Post holes for a newer, larger palisade line had already been set, but the timber walls themselves had not yet gone up. Crow Creek was, in the most literal sense, caught mid-renovation. The community had read the danger correctly. They had simply not finished building the answer to it in time. Whatever the immediate spark, nearly an entire community, mid-expansion, mid-construction of its own defenses, went into a ditch they had dug to keep themselves alive. Number 8. The Tollense Valley. The Tollense is a slow, reed-choked river in northeastern Germany, and for most of its length, it looks like nothing in particular. In 1996, an amateur archaeologist found a single arm bone with a flint arrowhead embedded in it, eroding from the riverbank near the village of Veltzen. That single bone eventually unraveled into the largest and oldest confirmed battlefield in Europe. Systematic excavation began in 2009 under Detlef Janssen of the State Office for Culture and Heritage of Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, working with Thomas Terberger. The finds are spread along roughly 3 kilometers of the river valley, and by the mid-2010s the excavated portion, by the team's own estimate, no more than 10% of the total find layer, had produced the remains of at least 140 individuals, along with wooden clubs, bronze and flint arrowheads, spear points, and the bones of at least 5 horses. Radiocarbon dating on wood, bone, and associated artifacts converges tightly on 1300 to 1250 BC, the middle of the European Bronze Age, more than 4 centuries before anything comparable was thought to exist on the continent. Chief archaeologist Janssen has been blunt about the arithmetic. If 140 individuals came out of 10% of the site, several hundred to several thousand people may lie in the rest of it. Published estimates for the total number of combatants, drawing on the density of remains and finds across the valley, range as high as 2,000. The injuries are the injuries of hand-to-hand combat between trained fighters, skull fractures from clubs, bronze arrowheads still lodged in bone, and, critically, healed fractures on some individuals showing old combat wounds that predate the battle itself. This was not a population of farmers picking up tools for the first time. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel and trace element analysis of the arrowheads indicate that some of the dead and some of the weapons came from hundreds of kilometers away, Bavaria, Moravia, possibly further. People fought and died here who were not local to the valley at all. That detail forced a rewrite of Bronze Age Europe. A conflict of this scale required something the period was not supposed to have: standing military organization, long-distance mobilization, and a logistics chain capable of moving armed men across the continent to a single river crossing. Science reporter accounts of the dig describe the archaeologists' own surprise at the density of the find layer. 1 square meter, opened in an early season, produced more bronze and bone than some entire regional site inventories. Terberger, who co-directs the project with Janssen, has been equally direct about what the healed wounds imply. Some of these men had fought and survived combat before, which means the society that produced this battle already had something resembling a standing class of fighters, trained and equipped well before the day the Tollense finally killed them. That single implication reshapes the timeline for organized European warfare by several centuries. Less than 4% of the site has been dug. Every new excavation season adds bodies. Number 7. Hambledon Hill and Crickley Hill. England's Neolithic causewayed enclosures are, on the surface, unthreatening things. Hilltop rings of ditches and banks, broken at intervals by gaps, built by early farming communities starting around 3700 BC. For decades, they were read as peaceful gathering places, sites for feasting, trade, and seasonal ceremony. 2 excavations changed that reading. At Hambledon Hill in Dorset, excavated across the 1970s and 1980s by Roger Mercer, the outer earthwork enclosing the hill's northern spur had been burned. Under the collapsed and scorched rampart, Mercer's team found the skeleton of a young man, killed by an arrow that had driven clean through his ribcage, buried beneath the very defenses that had failed to protect him. Scattered through the burned layer were more than 50 leaf-shaped flint arrowheads, many still showing the impact fractures of having struck something solid. At Crickley Hill in Gloucestershire, excavated over roughly 2 decades by Philip Dixon, the pattern repeated with even greater density. A concentrated scatter of hundreds of arrowheads was found clustered around the enclosure's entrance and along its palisade line, consistent with a massed volley fired at a gateway during an assault. The timber palisade behind that gateway had been burned to the ground. Nobody was found buried in the ash at Crickley. The dead, if there were survivors left to bury them, were evidently taken elsewhere. But the arrowhead scatter alone describes an attack, not a ceremony. Taken together, these 2 sites, roughly contemporary and roughly 130 kilometers apart, forced a revision of how Britain's first farmers are understood. These were not undefended gathering grounds. They were fortifications, built by communities who anticipated exactly the kind of assault that eventually came for at least 2 of them. The skeleton under Hambledon's rampart, in particular, complicates any reading of these enclosures as purely symbolic architecture. Someone built a wall there expecting it to stop an arrow. It did not stop this one. What triggered these attacks is, again, unrecoverable. The most common explanation on offer is competition over the fixed, defensible high ground itself, at a moment when Britain's Neolithic population was climbing and good enclosed land was not. Radiocarbon modeling, published in the 2000s, and refined since places both burnings within a century or 2 of each other, tightening the case that this was not coincidence, but a genuine regional pattern of hilltop warfare, running through southern Britain's earliest farming centuries. Mercer, writing about Hambledon Hill decades after his own excavation, described the enclosure less as a settlement than as a refuge that failed at the one moment it was needed. Whatever the cause, the earliest farming communities of the British Isles were building fortresses and burning each other's within a few centuries of picking up agriculture at all. Evidence that the arrival of farming in Britain brought organized violence with it, rather than displacing an older, gentler way of life. Number 6. Asparn Schletz, in the Weinviertel region of Lower Austria, at a site called Asparn an der Zaya, or Schletz, a large village of the linear Bandkeramic culture. The first farmers of Central Europe sat inside a defensive ditch dug around 5000 BC. In the 1980s, excavation of that ditch began turning up human remains in quantities that made the site, for a time, the largest known massacre of prehistoric Europe. Excavations led by Helmut Wendel through the 1980s and 1990s recovered the disarticulated remains of at least 67 individuals, and subsequent estimates based on unexcavated portions of the ditch have run as high as 200 or more. Nearly the entire skeletal population of the village appears to be represented. Infants, children, adolescents, and adults of both sexes, thrown into the enclosure ditch that had been built to keep an enemy out and instead became a mass grave. The trauma is uniform and severe. Crushed skulls from stone axes dominate the injury pattern, the same signature later found at Talheim and Schöneck-Kilianstädten, and taken together the three sites define what is now called the Central European LBK crisis. A cluster of massacre sites clustered near the very end of the culture's roughly 4-century run, right as its population and its settlement network appear to have been approaching some kind of ecological or social ceiling. One demographic detail stands out at Asparn Schletz specifically. Adult women of reproductive age are conspicuously underrepresented in the ditch relative to what a whole village population should look like. As at Crow Creek, 35 centuries and an ocean apart, the likeliest explanation is not that women were spared. It is that they were taken. What makes Asparn Schletz sit apart from Talheim and Schöneck-Kilianstädten is scale. This was not a raiding party or an extended family group. This was, as far as the excavated evidence can show, an entire agricultural settlement, dug into by its own defenses, eliminated in what appears to have been a single episode near the collapse of the first farming culture Central Europe ever had. Wendel's excavation notes also record something the other two sites lack: evidence that the ditch itself, before it became a grave, had been the settlement's actual line of defense, complete with a palisade whose burned post holes survive alongside the bone. The people of Asparn Schletz built a wall specifically to stop what eventually happened to them, in the same way the people of Hambledon Hill did on the other side of the continent, and in the same way the people of Crow Creek would 3,500 years later on a different continent entirely. The wall did not hold any of the three times. Number 5. Schöneck-Kilianstädten. In 2006, road construction crews near Frankfurt, Germany, exposed a linear pottery culture settlement ditch containing a jumble of disarticulated human bone. A team led by Christian Meyer, then at the University of Mainz, spent years reconstructing what had happened to the people inside it, and published the results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. The ditch held the remains of at least 26 individuals, adults and children, but conspicuously no infants and, once again, a shortfall of young adult women relative to a natural population. Radiocarbon placed the event at roughly 5000 BC, the same narrow window as Talheim and Asparn Schletz, deepening the case that Central Europe's first farmers went through a genuinely catastrophic period of internal violence right at the end of their cultural run. What separates Schöneck-Kilianstädten from the other LBK sites is a specific, deliberate act of mutilation. More than half of the recovered shin bones had been intentionally broken, either immediately before death or immediately after. The fracture patterns are not consistent with the kind of trauma that produces a fatal wound, and Meyer's team concluded they represented either torture of the still living or ritualized mutilation of the freshly dead, performed by attackers who had already won. The rest of the injury profile matches Talheim. Crushed skulls from stone axes, adzes, and arrow wounds, all peri-mortem, all unhealed. There is no evidence of ritual burial. The bodies were simply deposited, commingled, into the ditch and left. Meyer's paper makes an argument that reframes all three LBK sites together. If violence on this scale were a rare isolated aberration, the massacre sites should scatter randomly across the 400-year span of the culture. They do not. They cluster hard at the very end. Whatever pressure was building on Europe's first farming societies, resource stress, climate shift, population running ahead of arable land, it broke multiple communities in roughly the same narrow window, in roughly the same brutal way, across a swath of Central Europe several hundred kilometers wide. Meyer's team was careful to note what the site does not show. There is no evidence of a fight, no defensive wounds on forearms, no sign that anyone here had a weapon in hand when the killing started. The people deposited at Schöneck-Kilianstädten were not defeated combatants. They were a population caught with no capacity to resist at all, which makes the deliberate breaking of their shins, after the fact, harder to read as anything other than a message aimed at whoever might have found the bodies. Number 4. Talheim. In 1983, construction workers digging a garden in the town of Talheim in Baden-Württemberg, southern Germany, uncovered human bone about 1.5 meters down. What followed was the excavation of a pit, roughly 2 meters deep, containing the commingled skeletons of at least 34 people. The dead were men, women, and children of the linear band ceramic culture. Radiocarbon dated to around 5000 BC, and the analysis, led over subsequent decades by Kurt Alt and Christian Meyer among others, found that 20 of the 34 showed unhealed perimortem blunt force trauma to the skull. The weapons responsible left a signature that matched 2 specific LBK tool types: the flatstone axe and the shoelast adze, both everyday farming implements repurposed, on this occasion, as murder weapons. A handful of individuals also carried arrow wounds. Genetic and isotopic analysis performed decades later added a detail the bones alone couldn't provide. The victims at Talheim were not a random assortment of strangers. They included close kin groups, buried together, killed together, and isotope signatures in their teeth indicate they were long-term local residents rather than recent arrivals. This was a community, killed as a community, and thrown into a single pit about 50 meters from the settlement enclosure they had presumably been defending when it happened. Because Talheim was excavated and published years before Schöneck-Kilianstädten, or the reassessment of Asparn Schletz, it became the reference case for an entire academic argument, whether the peaceful image of Europe's first farmers, inherited from decades of assuming the Neolithic was calmer than the periods before and after it, could survive contact with the evidence. It could not. Later work by researchers, including Christian Meyer, applied strontium isotope analysis to the Talheim teeth specifically, comparing local versus non-local signatures across the group. The results showed a mixed population. Some individuals had grown up elsewhere and married into the community in the ordinary way small farming settlements exchange people. That detail matters because it means whoever attacked Talheim killed newcomers and lifelong residents with the same indifference. For a settlement that likely numbered somewhere between 30 and 50 people, to lose 34 of them in a single event is not a skirmish. Proportionally, it is closer to the annihilation of a nation. Number 3. Ofnet Cave, above the village of Holheim, on the rim of the Nördlinger Ries crater in Bavaria. A modest limestone cave called Grosse Ofnet was excavated across 1907 and 1908 by Robert Rudolf Schmidt of Tübingen. What he found near the cave's entrance were 2 pits, roughly 1 meter apart, packed with human skulls. The 2 pits together held somewhere between 33 and 38 individual skulls and partial skulls, along with the first 2 cervical vertebrae in many cases, meaning heads had been removed with the top of the spine still attached, then deliberately arranged. The skulls were coated in red ochre, oriented so that most faced west, and accompanied by an extraordinary quantity of grave goods, more than 200 pierced red deer canine teeth, and by some counts, thousands of shell beads. Whoever placed them there was performing an act of reverence, not disposal. Reverence and violence are not mutually exclusive, and the skulls carry both. Analysis led by David Freyer identified perimortem trauma and cut marks, consistent with decapitation on a majority of the individuals in the larger pit. Radiocarbon dating, refined by later projects into the 2010s, places the material in the Mesolithic, roughly 6400 BC, thousands of years before agriculture reached this part of Europe, and at a moment when hunter-gatherer bands here are usually assumed to have been small, mobile, and, per the old orthodoxy, largely unconcerned with organized violence. Demographically, the assemblage is strange even by the standards of a massacre. Adult men are underrepresented relative to women and children. Freyer's interpretation, contested but still the leading one, is that this may represent the near-total destruction of a single hunter-gatherer band while its adult male hunters were away, the people left in camp. Women, children, the old, killed and beheaded, their heads collected and given a burial their bodies apparently never received. The alternative reading, argued by researchers including Jorg Orschiet, is that the 2 pits accumulated over generations, rather than a single afternoon, representing a long-running mortuary tradition rather than one catastrophic raid. New radiocarbon programs, including reanalysis of overlooked material from earlier 19th century excavations at the site, are still working to settle which is correct, and recent dating on previously unstudied fragments has continued to fall within the same tight window associated with the two skull nests, which if anything strengthens the single event case rather than weakening it. Either way, the trauma on the bones themselves is not in dispute, and the tenderness of the burial is not in dispute either. The ochre, the shell beads, the deliberate orientation to the west are not the actions of people indifferent to their dead. That combination is the reason Ofnet keeps getting revisited. It is simultaneously the earliest well-documented instance of a society mourning its dead with real ceremony, and one of the earliest instances of a society being violently exterminated. Someone, repeatedly or all at once, was taking heads in the forests of Ice Age Bavaria, 6,000 years before anyone in this story had ever seen a plowed field. Number 2. Nataruk, 30 kilometers west of Kenya's Lake Turkana, in ground that is now dry scrubland. A shallow depression once held the edge of a lagoon fed by a much larger version of the lake. 10,000 years ago it was fertile, forested at its margins, and inhabited by hunter-gatherers who fished it and camped along its shore. The site was found in 2012 and excavated by a team from Cambridge University's Leverhulme Center for Human Evolutionary Studies, led by Marta Mirazon-Lar, whose findings were published in Nature in 2016. What her team uncovered was the partial remains of 27 individuals, 21 adults split evenly between men and women, and 6 children, lying where they fell, unburied, preserved by burial under the lagoon's own sediment rather than by any hand that cared for them. 12 of the skeletons were complete enough to assess for trauma, and 10 of those 12 showed unambiguous evidence of violent death. Skulls crushed by blunt weapons, hands and knees broken, arrow wounds to the neck and thorax. One man appears to have taken 2 projectile strikes to the head and a blow to the knees before falling face down into the shallow water where he was found 9,000 years later. Another had an obsidian bladelet still lodged in his skull, not quite penetrating the bone, alongside a second wound that crushed the right side of his face. The obsidian is the detail that turns this from a killing into a war. Obsidian is rare at other late Stone Age sites in this part of West Turkana. Lar's team has argued that its presence indicates the attackers came from a different territory. Carrying weapons made from material, their victims did not use themselves. There were no dwellings, no valuables, and no sign of a settlement at the site. This appears to have been a hunter-gatherer band caught in the open, away from home, and eliminated by a group that had traveled to find them. At 10,000 years old, Nataruk was, at the time of its publication, the earliest scientifically dated evidence of group conflict between human bands anywhere in the world. A title it would only lose once, the Jebel Sahaba reanalysis pushed the record further back still. It complicated a comfortable assumption that had stood for most of the 20th century, that hunter-gatherers, owning little and tied to no land, had nothing worth organized killing over. Study co-author Robert Foley, also of Cambridge, framed the finding as a statement about human biology rather than about any one culture. The same species capable of the cooperation that built agriculture, cities, and eventually spacecraft is also, demonstrably, capable of this, and the capability is not a recent acquisition. At least 2 of the victims had their hands bound before they were killed, based on the position of the wrist bones relative to the body, evidence of restraint, of captives being executed rather than simply run down in a chase. Whoever did this to the people at Nataruk clearly disagreed with the idea that a hunter-gatherer band had nothing worth killing for. Number 1. Jebel Sahaba. In the early 1960s, as the Aswan High Dam project raced to flood the Nile Valley behind it, archaeologists from around the world scrambled to excavate everything in its path before the water arrived. Among the sites Fred Wendorf, of Southern Methodist University, worked in that window was a low rise on the Nile's east bank in what is now northern Sudan, designated Site 117 and known ever since by the name of the hill beside it, Jebel Sahaba. What Wendorf's team found there, and what a full re-excavation by Wendorf's original material and a 2021 reanalysis led by Isabelle Crevecoeur of the Université de Bordeaux and Daniel Antoine of the British Museum, confirmed in exhaustive detail, was a cemetery of 61 individuals, men, women, and children, buried over a period that radiocarbon dating now places between roughly 13,400 and 18,600 years ago, making it the oldest known formal cemetery in the Nile Valley. More than half of those 61 people carry evidence of interpersonal violence. Crevecoeur and Antoine's microscopic re-examination of every bone identified over 100 previously undocumented lesions, healed and unhealed, along with stone projectile points still embedded in bone at multiple burials, not placed beside the bodies as grave goods, but lodged inside them. A quarter of the individuals with wounds show both old, healed injuries and fresh, fatal ones, meaning the same people had been attacked more than once across their lives before the attack that finally killed them. For decades, Jebel Sahaba was read as the site of a single decisive battle. The earliest known war, fought in one violent episode by two late Pleistocene population, competing over a shrinking, increasingly arid Nile Valley as the last ice age tightened its grip on northeastern Africa. The 2021 reanalysis, published in Scientific Reports, revised that picture without softening it. Working under a microscope rather than the naked eye Wendorf's generation had relied on, Crevecoeur and Antoine's team traced the direction and angle of every projectile impact and found something the original excavation could not have detected. The wound patterns are inconsistent with a single-pitched engagement, and instead resemble ambush, ranged attack, close-quarters retaliation, in varying combinations across the burials. The pattern of wounds, the mix of healed and fresh trauma, and the absence of any single mass casualty layer point instead towards something arguably grimmer. Not one battle, but a long, low grinding sequence of raids and ambushes, repeated against the same community across years or generations, as competition for the shrinking, fertile margin of the Nile intensified around them. The CNRS team behind the reassessment has been explicit that this revision does not make Jebel Sahaba less significant. If anything, it makes it more so. Not a single dramatic massacre, but a chronic generational condition, violence as an ordinary feature of life along the Nile, for the people who lived and died at Site 117, endured and re-endured by the same community over a span long enough for children to grow up, get hurt, heal, and be hurt again before the wound that finally killed them, either reading, arrives at the same floor. Whether it was one battle or 50 small ones, organized, repeated, lethal violence between human groups is documented here more than 13,000 years ago. Before agriculture, before permanent settlement, before pottery, before almost every institution later blamed for inventing war in the first place. The ice was still retreating. The Sahara had not yet finished becoming a desert. And on the banks of a river that would one day be called the cradle of civilization, people were already killing each other for a strip of livable ground, burying their dead with the arrowheads still inside them, and getting up to do it again. The site itself no longer exists in any visitable sense. The Aswan High Dam that Wendorf's team was racing against went into operation in 1970, and the waters of Lake Nasser now sit over the ground where Site 117 was found. The 61 skeletons were removed before the flood, and since 2002, they have been held in the collections of the British Museum, which is the only reason Crevecoeur and Antoine were able to put them under a microscope at all 60 years after they were first dug up. The valley that produced them is underwater. The people who study them are still finding new wounds. Every entry on this list describes the same underlying fact from a different angle, that the capacity for organized, repeated, lethal violence between human groups is not a byproduct of civilization. It came first. Cities didn't invent war. War was already old when the first city was built, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than bronze, older by a wide margin than agriculture itself. What changed over those 13,000 years was never the underlying behavior. It was the scale of what a society could bring to bear when it decided to use it. A handful of ambushers on the Nile, a hunting band caught in the open at Lake Turkana, a farming village dug into its own defensive ditch, a Bronze Age army of 2,000 meeting another on a riverbank, a lake full of the sordid bones of the losing side. Each entry on this list is a data point on the same rising curve. The weapons kept improving. The organization kept scaling. The instinct did not need to be invented even once. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.